Hello and welcome back to Techno Trek Tuesdays. I'm your host, Menhel Yunus, and you are with the happy gang that is here to talk about propulsion of the future. Joining me today are Brandon Yon and Brian White. We're going to bring you some amazing ideas and talk about some amazing forms of propulsion from the future. Are you ready, gentlemen?
Let's
Yep,
punch it.
let's do it.
Welcome back, guys. How are you today? Let's start with Brandon. How are you, buddy?
Pretty good as always.
And Brian, how are you today?
Oh, can't complain. Wouldn't do any good
Wonderful.
anyways, right?
I'm here to help you guide your story today, which is to talk about a little bit about propulsion of the future. I'm joined, of course, by Brian White and Brandon Yon. They're here to provide expertise, to answer questions, to tell their story, and provide opinions on this specific technology of propulsion and why it's important within Star Trek. Thanks for joining us, guys. Thanks so much. So, if you could just get us a little bit, I think our previous viewers would love to know did we leave off? How did our conversation go last time? So, I'm going to just quickly kick to Brian. Maybe just help us remind us, like some of the things we talked about, propulsion of the present. Go ahead, man.
Yeah. So, hey everybody. So last time on the Tech Trek show, we were talking about different forms of propulsion from the present. You know, things that we use now or things that we're considering using now. Things like solid fuel, liquid fuel systems, cryogenic propulsion, things of that nature. You know, you've got your Hall effect thrusters that we were talking about as well. It's an interesting little topic. Plasma thrusters and ion thrusters and things of that nature. Just different means of propelling a spaceship in orbit around the planet and potentially further out, like say to the moon or Mars or something like that. So yeah, so basically, what we're going to be talking about today is going to be stuff from the future. You know, so for that, I'm going to toss this one over to Brandon and let him tell you all about some of the interesting means of propulsion that we have yet to discover.
Brandon?
Well, thanks, Brian. Thanks, guys. I want to start off with there's a lot to talk about the past and a lot to talk about the current, and a lot of the current is still used in the future. One of the critical components that we see on every single starship is the RCS thrusters, which are still chemical mixture thrusters on the ship. And they're on every single ship, every single vector, every single corner. It's how they keep themselves in line and oriented and directed. Um, in the episode Booby Trap with Picard and the Next Generation cast, the only way they could get out of that booby trap was
Mm-hmm.
to use two thrusters and a small full impulse burst for a short amount of time. Those thrusters aren't your standard, left, right, sides. Those are your RCS thrusters they were using, which are again chemical fuels. So even in the future, even in what Star Trek sees as our future, we still see a lot of past propulsion used. Now, granted, I'm going to throw a little bone out there that could be because this was developed back in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, so it's all we could wrap our head around. But it might also be the absolute best, most effective version of micro propulsion that exists. So I will leave
It's pretty
start off with that.
it's pretty wild that we still use those older, the stuff that's from the present day in Star Trek. Like
Well,
I
if
know
it
it's in
ain't
the future.
broke, don't fix it, right?
Yeah, but still it's a chemical propellant in a way, isn't it?
It is.
Isn't aren't we still there's a
Mhm.
consumable involved.
Exactly.
That is
That's
interesting to me.
that's where the
Yeah.
bizarre collectors come in, is they're always collecting materials
Yep.
regardless of what you're doing through space. So that's a very helpful thing.
Oh,
There
yeah.
must be some kind of
Um,
equation for how they synthesize. They're like, oh, we have this hydrogen on board, or we have this deuterium on board. Like, there's some replicable stuff and some non-replicable stuff. So, for
Mhm.
instance, they do like sequencing. Like, they can break down food and atomize it and whatever. Why can't we? That is interesting. Like, why don't we create deuterium? I guess you have to collect it up because of the way that it is as a radiation. Like, it has an extra neutron. So,
Well, that's
exactly.
probably a subject for another time. But briefly, it might be because the patterns are too complex for the replicator to replicate, which is why they would actually have to find it or mine it or whatever they have to do. But
interesting.
um, because the replicator is only capable of reproducing simple patterns,
Yeah,
clothing, food, etc., etc. So
it may be an energetic barrier. I think
yeah.
that it doesn't make sense. Brandon once brought up the fact that there's an efficiency issue with creating antimatter. That was also in the last episode.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it's like what he likened it to, and I didn't realize this as well, is when these ships go off, they're almost like filled up like batteries
Hmm.
and they're decaying. There's only like so much that they have, so they get refueled or whatever because
Correct.
they're large antimatter storage and creation things on these big, let's go back to this deep space, whatever. Let's go to this star base or whatever. And so
Yeah.
part of that is refueling, even though it's never really stated, but Brandon knew or had discussed that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yep.
so some of the slower than light propulsion, Brandon, we're still using it in the current Star Trek model. Um,
Absolutely.
take it away. Tell me some more about that.
But well, it's very simple. We got fusion power that powers impulse engines. That's the more modern version of, basically, for all intents and purposes, impulse is a practical hyper efficient ion drive. So, however,
Cool.
it's done in a different way. That the way that it's described is that the field grills actually reabsorb the discharged electrons and the discharged particles and flush it back into the system. So there's no actual exhaust. That's where the impulse manifolds are, is actually in that rear red grill that you see on every impulse engine. That's actually the reception manifold. So even and the thrust, and I'm not completely sure how they do it because it doesn't make any physics sense, but
Mm.
we'll have to get Rick Sternbach to let us know on how that works. um, but the reality is it's basically an ion system, and it propels the ions out, but it recaptures the electrons, pushes them back into the system, reionizes the next system, and so on and so forth. But that's
Is this
all
what
slower than light.
is this what you're talking about
This
here?
this is a nacelle that includes that allows the ship to create a warp field and a warp bubble that displaces subspace, allowing the ship to travel faster than light. So this
Okay.
is actually, let's go ahead and show the screenshot of the Phoenix.
Okay.
So this is the first known human warp flight capable vessel.
Hmm.
Zephyrin Cochrane created it, and it originally had two nacelles. On each one of those nacelles are warp field coils, and those coils are powered by a fusion-based infused power plasma, which is the
Hmm.
same technology that we're still using 400 years into the future in that shot that Manny just showed us with that nacelle. We're still powering the coils inside the nacelles with a plasma based power system, charges the coils, and then it sends off a pulse, which is what you see in the light flash when the ship goes into warp. Now, that pulse is the initial formation of a warp bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And that warp bubble is what allows the ship to actually travel faster than light in the warp style transportation, which is
Fascinating.
factors.
I believe Trip Tucker referred to it in one episode as a graviton displacement drive or something of that nature.
He actually did. He actually did refer to it as that, which is the first time that that's been referenced. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the way it is actually a subspace displacement drive.
Yeah.
Now, what subspace is? Don't ask that question. That's for another time. That's a whole other thing. It's a layer of space that we assume exists, and therefore we present the physics of Star Trek around it. But when it comes to faster than light travel, there's so many different options here. But without a faster than light travel, even modern science, we would have a problem getting to our closest star. We're looking at 4 light years to get to Proxima Centauri.
Yeah. It's
So
about 80,000 years.
I mean, we're talking, yeah. So even at 0.3 C or full impulse, which is what we could have, we're talking about, a generational ship just to get there.
Sorry,
So
that's
we gotta
so
have-
small. I have
No,
a
you're
picture
fine.
here now of the warp coil.
Exactly.
So
Now
small.
that's the one that Voyager, when they were doing refits on their own ship, because of how long they were in the Delta Quadrant, they had to literally disassemble the cells and repair their coils. And it's the same type of coil that's in the Enterprise D nacelles. It's the same
Right.
type of coil that's in the Delta Flyer, same type of coil that's in the Defiant, same, all the way back to the Phoenix. So we've used the same technology, the same materials for,
in the
300 years.
episode, what was it, Relics, I believe it was, Geordie LaForge told, Scotty that a lot of the technology hadn't changed in the past, 70, 80
100 years. Exactly.
And, basically that's pretty much because, it was already as efficient as it was going to get at the time. So they saw no reason to change it.
Exactly.
And I imagine it would be kind of the same thing here as well. I mean, it's going to be the same way because they see no reason to change it.
Mm-hmm.
It works.
Exactly. Now, based on some of the faster than light principles that we've seen, anybody who's watched any part of Star Trek, we know warp drive. Well, what else do we have other than warp drive? There's a ton of other different types of propulsion systems out there.
That's right.
To start us off, we've got wormhole travel. And throughout all of Star Trek, there's been, multiple variants of what wormhole travel is depicted as. But for all intents and purposes, it is a place in space that is tied to another place in space that shortens the time travel between point A to point B. It's almost like taking a jet from New York to Los Angeles instead of traveling on the highway system. You're getting there a lot faster, but at the same time, you still have to travel the same distance. And because of it,
I've thrown up the wormhole from DS9.
Yeah, that's the DS9 wormhole. We also have the Barzan wormhole,
which was unstable on one end. Yeah,
correct. And even Voyager encountered the other end of it and tried to stabilize it so they could get home, and that didn't work. And then we have the wormhole that was an artificial creation done by Dr. Lennar Khan on Deep Space Nine, where she was trying to create one for the first time because it would give Starfleet a distinct advantage in the Dominion War.
Yeah, that's
and then
the Barzan wormhole there.
Correct. Yep. That's the Alpha Quadrant end of the Barzan wormhole.
Yeah. Actually, no, that was the Delta Quadrant.
Oh, that's right. Was it Delta or Gamma?
Pretty sure
Delta. You're right.
That was the Delta. Yeah, but I think that screenshot is of the Alpha Quadrant. The one where Voyager encounters it, that's the Delta. But even that's the Delta Quadrant version.
Yeah.
But even the Enterprise, the original Enterprise, the CC-1701 refit, it encountered a wormhole type phenomena back in the first movie. The motion picture. So there's been wormhole travel throughout all of Star Trek. What does
Mhm.
that mean? Well, it's a different type of travel. Now, there's even different types of travel within wormholes.
Right.
You can even have a temporal wormhole, which is like the small one in Voyager where they transported the Romulan
Uh,
through time.
yeah,
Yeah.
or
Um,
little green men, for example.
exactly, where
Yeah.
you have chemosite interfering with a warp drive, creating a space time tunnel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but all of this stuff is a different type of travel, but it's still fast and light. Even Kirk taking the bird of prey around the sun created time travel, but it's still fast and light travel. He actually used the gravity of the sun as a propulsion boost to get
Mm-hmm.
them up to speed. Thanks, Sulu, for your magnificent piloting in that episode. In that movie, fantastic
Right.
work there. So we've got graviton-based technology or gravity-based propulsion, and in Star Trek, there's a theory that there's a particle called a graviton. We haven't found it
Mm-hmm.
yet. We're not sure what it is, if it even exists in science, but there's a theory that it does exist. And in the Star Trek universe, if you projected a graviton field in front of you and it was strong enough, it could actually pull your ship along. One of the things that was proposed against the Borg was a high powered graviton field
Mm-hmm.
to damage or take the Borg cube off course before it went to Wolf 359 with Picard aboard. It was one of their countermeasures they were trying to present. So it's a type of travel or a type of inhibitor that they were trying to present to prevent a certain thing to happen. So we've got that option.
Didn't work, but it was a good idea.
Exactly. Um,
To clarify, the graviton is technically a type of particle that is supposed to hold some sort of gravitational field or gravitational wave inside of it, so that gravity is no longer part of a field, but is actually held within some sort of particle. And so when they say they want to use gravitons, they're actually using particle theory to
Mhm.
manipulate the space time around it.
Yep.
correct. Yep. Because as we all know, gravity actually does bend space time,
Hmm.
Yes,
which
the
is why the
closer you
theory
get
of
to
relativity.
right. So
It's one of the
the
reasons why
bodies.
when you get close to the event horizon of a black hole, everything starts to get a little wonky. You know.
It's a time dilation effect. So,
Exactly.
Exactly.
in Einstein's special relativity, you have time dilation where you have a frame of reference on Earth, for instance, versus that when you're on outer space. This is why in a warp bubble, we're also. This is interesting to me, and we had discussed a little bit about warp effects. If you're in a warp static bubble, okay, um, the bubble around you is kind of moving you through space and time,
Hmm.
and within yourself in the bubble you're still relative to the universe. You're not experiencing a different time differential than the rest of the universe, which is different than some faster than light effects in which you are moving slower simply compared to the rest of the universe. So the Einstein's twin paradox: if you're a twin baby, you're a 1 year old baby, you leave Earth and you leave for like a light year, or like in terms of distance, or a couple light years, and then you come back. 50 years may have happened on Earth, whereas a year may have only happened on the ship. This is because that there is a differential between the relative frame of reference of time on the spaceship with that of the rest of the universe. And so this is
Exactly.
not present in the warp static shell.
Kind of reminds me of Anorax and the Krenim time ship as well.
Ah,
But
yes, they pulled themselves completely out of time,
yep.
completely outside of the actual frame of reference of the
So
universe.
anything
Yep.
that they did to correct the timeline wouldn't affect them.
Exactly.
Right.
And they
So that's
still were able to travel at warp. So think about
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
That's an
I mean that
interesting.
takes a tremendous amount of power generation there.
Absolutely.
That's
Makes you
probably
wonder
one
what
of the
their power
reasons why
core
the ship
was.
had to be so big. Yeah.
hmm
Well, I
Hmm.
mean, Trip did ask, and or no, sorry, that was
Chakotay?
Voyager.
Tom, Tom did.
Yeah,
Tom asked
Tom.
yeah.
what the power core
Tom
was. Yeah.
Tom did
Of course
ask.
he did.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting my series
No, it's
mixed up in
okay.
my
That's
head.
good.
But
It
yeah,
happens.
they did ask, but they weren't very forthcoming with that information, obviously.
No, no, they weren't.
Though they did have
Um,
the engineer that did, offer to help them to disable it for them.
I think it's easier in Star Trek when they gloss over these things, of course, with the techno babble. But that's,
Yeah,
I mean, what we're here to talk. Like, we are very interested in how these things work because, as we know in Star Trek, science fiction is becoming science fact. This is no longer fantasy. We're coming up with real field equations that, although unsuccessful in like any practical sense, have inspired real scientists to push forward and like to move from the fantastical element to the actual possibility, even however low probability it is.
Hmm.
So absolutely, I'm just looking here at this space
and
catapult.
and and this just came into my mind because we're talking about
Yeah.
subspace travel. Well, and I don't know why I didn't have this in our document when we were talking about it, but this just came, popped into my frond, as Colonel O'Neill would say in Stargate. Um, this was something developed by an alien who wanted to get home,
Hmm.
and he
Yeah,
created a subspace catapult that
he
would
was trapped in the
launch.
Delta Quadrant, the same as Voyager was, and he wanted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now this is the one called the Voyager Conspiracy. I think it's season
I don't know.
4 or season 5, something like that.
Here
Um,
we go.
Yeah.
and it locks graviton tractors onto the ship and launches it into null space,
Yeah.
and
It's
it can
basically a
emerge
subspace
100.
slingshot. Yeah.
Exactly. So the ship can emerge from subspace 100, 200, 300, 500, 10,000, 1,000 light years away from the catapult. And as long as you had the proper shield calibrations, you would emerge completely unscathed and without any harm. This was tested by both the engineer, the designer who created it, and by Voyager, who got themselves 10,000 light years closer to home. No,
Hmm.
was it 10,000 or was it 2,000? I think it was
Uh,
2,000 light years. They launched, yeah, 2,000 light years. So it cut 2 years, almost 3 years off their journey or something at that point. So this would be, this is something else that is a type of graviton technology in the Star Trek universe that is a type of propulsion. It
Hmm.
is literally a slingshot for all
Yes.
intents and purposes. But hey, it is a propulsion matrix. What else is it when you apply force behind an object and you push it? It's propulsion.
So speaking of which, what I will bring up honestly is Soliton waves. There's a time when we talked about Soliton waves. Isn't that a form of slingshot or propulsion? Like you're riding a kind of gravitational wave through space and time, some sort of eddy or whatever it is, like these
mhm.
natural ripples in space time. So in a way, that's a type of propulsion, but it's almost like you're sailing over it or surfing over it. How is that different
Ex-
from this
Exactly.
catapult?
So, gotcha. That's a perfect segue. So the soliton wave, actually, it's exactly what you stated. It is a gravity wave that you
Mhm.
surf through space. The biggest problem with that and why it didn't work out well is the amount of power that's needed to create this wave and how it would interfere with other travel.
Mhm.
So you would have to have soliton wave pathways, or basically highways through space, and a soliton projector on one planet, and it would have to be timed and powered just right so that it would disperse as you got to the other planet, so the ship could slow itself down and go
Yeah.
back into.
Preferably without destroying the ship in the process.
Exactly. Now the biggest flaw, it's a fantastic theory, and actually this would be something that I would like to see us develop currently as
Mhm.
humanity, because this would be a fantastic means of propulsion if we could calibrate it and get it right.
Mhm.
Because
There's no chemical propellant.
there's no chemical propellant. All you'd have to have is enough for thrusters for guidance and
Mhm.
whatever you would need to slow yourself down, and the proper shielding to prevent yourself from being damaged or destroyed by the gravitational waves. So
Hmm.
as
Mhm.
long as you had that, there's no need for a warp core. There's no need for a warp drive. There's no need
Yeah.
for an nacelle. There's no need for any of this kind of stuff. You just have to have the soliton wave. And that's why it was an absolutely spectacular idea.
Mhm.
But it would literally have to be, I have to point my wave generator at this planet, launch the wave at just the right time, and the ship has to jump on it and ride through the universe.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And they can't steer. So if an asteroid got in the way or anything like that, it would collide with the ship, and there's no way to prevent that. Basically, like firing a bullet.
Yep. Pretty
So in a
much.
way, it's very similar to the catapult, with one major exception: gravity waves take place in normal space time.
Mhm.
The
Right.
catapult is a subspace. It launches you into null space to emerge on the other side.
Oh,
And so that by launching into subspace, you have absolutely zero danger.
That takes me to my next question, Brendan. What is the difference between Slipstream and Coaxial Warp? And the reason that I tag on there is just that these are some kind of subspace corridor or something where you're riding along, but it's actually enclosed. It's like a tube through space. We've seen many versions of the Slipstream, whether it's the corridors that Voyager sent the messages in, which is just like
Mm-hmm.
energetic. There's physical ones. There's the Transwarp conduits.
Mm-hmm. The
So
Vaudouar
the
network.
Vodwar
Yeah.
network, that's a good one. The what is the other one? The hunting race?
The Herodians.
The
The
Herogen, yeah.
Herogen, right? They had one. I think it was more I don't think they physically ran
They
into that one.
they used warp drive. The
Yeah.
Herogen used warp drive. What actually is interesting about the Herogen is that they captured quantum singularities as their power source, very much like the Romulans did, but they used it for their subspace antenna network instead of to power their ships.
Wow.
So that's where some of that happens. Now, the one thing about the Herogen too is they could enter a certain type of stealth that even Voyager couldn't detect on arrival,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not really a type of propulsion, but it's a type of disruption around the ship, kind of like me cloaking my uh, cup here.
Yes.
Um,
I love it.
but yeah, but to answer your question, the difference between the subspace corridors or transwarp or slipstream as a group, they're all very similar. There's different types of slipstream. We have the slipstream by Voyager. We have the slipstream by the Dauntless. There's a couple different kinds of transwarp. We have the original transwarp, which was conceived as the Enterprise, not the Enterprise B, but the Excelsior, that
Okay.
Scotty sabotaged,
Yep.
which was literally technically that wasn't transwarp; it was hyper warp for all intents and purposes. And then
Yeah.
you have the Borg transwarp, which, as shown here, requires a specialty type of coil. Voyager stole one of these coils, installed it on Voyager, installed it on the Delta Flyer. We're able to save 7 from it. And that allowed them to travel faster, in a much faster way from there as well. But there's two major things with Slipstream and Transwarp. And the difference between Slipstream and Transwarp is Slipstream generates a conduit as you flow inside of it. So it's
Mm-hmm.
basically like an encapsulated tunnel, similar to a wormhole, but it's temporary. It disperses itself once it's finished. A transwarp conduit establishes a permanent
Mm-hmm.
conduit through space that
That you
can
have
be
to
seen,
manually open
analyzed,
up. Yeah.
and entered. Correct. And it has entrance apertures, exit
Yes.
apertures. So it is a
Even had like
permanent.
bracing, right? It had like bracing in it and
Correct.
shit.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. The Transwarp hub actually has bracing inside to keep those conduits stable. So that's the
The
difference between
enormous
Transwarp
energy
and
that's
slip
like,
space.
yeah, yeah.
Oh man, that's amazing. But to talk about space folding, it's very similar to wormholes, except for one major critical component, at least in the Star Trek world. Wormholes still allow a time travel system.
Mm-hmm.
So to travel from the alpha quadrant to the gamma quadrant through the Deep Space Nine wormhole or the Bajoran wormhole, the Edron end, it takes 10, 15 minutes. I don't think they ever give an actual time frame of how long it takes to traverse, but there is time in there because you can see the Dominion fleet coming at you. You can hold your engines and stand in the middle and then turn around and go back. So even though it's a wormhole, you're not entering one side and poof, you're on the other side. There's a
Right.
transit time. Coaxial warp is an instantaneous pass from one part of the galaxy, one part of space, to another part of space. There is no time transit.
That
There's no transit time between the 2 points. You blink and you're there.
Right.
so what I have up here is the Bajoran wormhole.
And
That's the Bajoran wormhole.
Yeah.
another interesting point would be that in folding space, the ship doesn't actually move. space actually moves around it.
Right.
So
Correct.
essentially, you are taking 2 points and bringing them together instantaneously to project the ship from one place to another.
This must
There,
require a huge
there's,
amount of energy.
yeah,
Oh yeah,
it does.
it would be
But
like taking this toilet paper
mhm.
and folding it like this, and you're
There
there.
must be something we're missing. Like in that world, you have subspace, which reaches across all of space. There
Correct.
must be some way to like have a non-linear attachment between parts of subspace, so that, and unlike regular space, which has a crunching, like it's just to bring these two pieces together would be just so much energy. The
Hmm.
energetic like value of like putting these together in subspace is probably less. So maybe we join through subspace rather than regular space, and that is kind of how you do
I
both
think you're
wormhole.
correct.
Yeah, it does
I think
seem.
you're correct. The only type of transport that I know of that doesn't use a subspace layer is a geodesic fold.
Mhm.
Right. I don't know if that
But
is
there's
the
so
image
much
that we have.
radiation. No, I
Yeah.
don't
Right,
have
that
an
you would
image of
never
that.
survive
It's
the
okay.
trip. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much radiation that no being could survive without being killed. So
Yeah.
What
a
was the
geodesic
image of
fold is components.
the Dauntless? I have the picture of the Dauntless here. What is the significance of that again?
That is the Slipstream Drive on the Dauntless.
Right.
Okay, let me just get to it here. Sorry.
Sure. And I'm
So
sorry, we're talking about this all out of order, so it threw your entire order sequence
No,
out
it's
of
okay.
it.
I like it. That's all
but
good.
yeah, with the Dauntless, essentially it was one of the. It was a ship that was supposed to be from Starfleet to transport the crew of Voyager to the Beta Quadrant back
The
home.
Alpha Quadrant, yeah.
What it ended up being was a trap laid by an alien whose entire race was assimilated by the Borg, and he felt that Voyager was responsible, so he wanted revenge. But what this particular drive was designed to do was to open a slipstream corridor and essentially deliver the crew to wherever the slipstream corridor ended. So
So, from what I'm understanding about the corridor itself, very much like a transwarp conduit, it's constructed. It's
yes,
It's
physically there, and then you're traveling through it. Someone
yeah,
had to have
you are projecting
the
a
projection is constructing
displacement
it.
in front of
I
you
see.
to open a corridor into subspace or whatever, and then essentially entering that.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
if that's correct, of course,
no that
Brandon.
that is 100%. You've nailed it on the head. You're opening an aperture for
Mhm.
a tunnel, and you're projecting that tunnel in front of you.
Right.
But it's, for all intents and purposes, it's like drilling a hole for like fiber optic cable. You
Hmm.
drill this massive hole through the ground, and you run your cable, and then you fill it in. So the
As you're
the
going, you're
as you're
projecting,
going,
projecting,
this
projecting,
the slipstream, yeah, it
yeah.
projects the slipstream corridor in front of you, and it collapses it behind you,
Hmm.
allowing you to travel through a tunnel that's 100% safe, and you can detect other tunnels nearby projected by other ships. But unless you're following in that alignment close enough, you have to generate your own brand new conduit. Whereas
Right.
Right.
Transwarp, it's once it's created by any ship, the conduit
Yeah.
is always there.
It's
You
a
just have to be
huge
able to
network
open
of
it.
these tunnels.
Exactly.
So basically, instead of the cable, that you dig,
You're
that you drill
leaving
through the
the
ground, yeah, you're essentially creating an ants colony of different tunnels and corridors and stuff that you can enter and exit at will.
exactly.
Now, my next part, guys, is, and they brought it up only, I think, a couple times, maybe that one time, that's really, is the coaxial drive. So I'll throw
Hmm.
that graphic up in a second, but what is the difference? So between this corridor creation and this coaxial drive, um, why do we call it a different thing? Is it different? Is it actually viscerally different, Brandon?
It is critically different. The coaxial drive is a point A to point B instantaneous transit. Basically, in my own mind, this is how I would describe coaxial warp. It's a transport. You are transporting yourself and your ship from one part of space to another without the use of a transporter. That's literally what it is. You're folding space into itself and going to the other side at the snap of a finger. Whereas Slipstream, you're digging a tunnel through subspace and coming out on the other side, there's still transit time. So again, it'd be like taking a transporter, like beaming from my house to yours, Manny, and instead of me taking a subway.
Wow.
And
Okay.
and even though that there is a subway, the subway is still a hell of a lot faster than me getting in a car and trying to drive to you in a car.
I see. Instead of
The
doing the
car would be
physical
warp
distance.
drive. Exactly.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
car would be warp drive. The subway would be slipstream or transwarp, and then coaxial would be the transporter. That's the
Okay.
easiest way of describing the difference between the three.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, just a few more things to discuss. I have these other images. I think it's the Voth. What did the Voth use? If we
They
remind our viewers, what are the Voth?
The Voth are an ancient race of dinosaurs that migrated to the Delta Quadrant, set up a culture and a civilization there, and they use transwarp.
Yeah, it was said that they were evolved from hadrosaurs, I believe.
Correct.
So basically, they potentially came from Earth.
Oh, absolutely.
I believe
Uh,
this is the ship. Is
Even
Correct.
this
even though their culture and their philosophies would basically consider such things to be heresy because
Heresy,
right?
exactly.
It's so funny. So,
but
what type
anyways.
of did they use transwarp? Is this
They
transwarp?
use they use a type of transwarp that is very similar to slipstream, where it generates a corridor, but the corridor is a temporary corridor. But
Ah,
it
okay.
is considered transwarp. I would actually consider this type of transwarp more along the lines of what the Excelsior was going to do, where it's more like a hyperspeed warp, where it's faster than warp, but it's not quite as fast as the Borg's transwarp. Is what I
Okay.
would. That's how I would rate it, because it's more along the
So,
same lines.
okay. Okay. That's
They
interesting.
actually referred to this as a spatial displacement.
Okay,
Oh,
there we go.
Oh no, no, scratch that. No, sorry, that was a different technology entirely. Spatial displacement was basically their version of a cloaking device. Um,
it
but
is?
Oh,
yeah,
that's right. That's what they. Yeah, that's what they
but yeah,
wore
they
to.
did have transwarp capabilities.
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
So now that we're on to transwarp, okay. So what is the difference, guys, between warp and transwarp?
Easy. Warp is projecting a subspace bubble around the ship and lightening the mass of the ship so that a limited propulsion system, such as thrusters or even impulse, if necessary, can actually push the vessel within that warp field bubble at hyperlight speeds. That's a warp. That's a warp drive. Transwarp, you have to have a coil or a certain type of transwarp engine, and you project a corridor in front of you that, depending on the type of transwarp, once established, that corridor is permanent. Whereas warp drive, it never establishes any kind of permanent corridor. It just creates a
Gotcha.
bubble around the ship.
Interesting. And I think that makes sense if you're talking about maybe augmenting whatever natural propulsion is happening from warp. Warp is still, in a way, you're consuming something in order
Yes.
to have warp. So what I would
Mhm.
say is maybe in the same way that impulse engines require like a kickstart, or even the antimatter engines need a kickstart, maybe the transwarp engines need like a warp kickstart, but then they enter something else, something new. Can
Correct.
you? Does that make sense? That's my
That,
understanding. My
you're
my
100%
feeble.
correct because to enter transwarp, you have to not only project an aperture opening via your deflector,
Hmm.
but you also have to be at super high impulse.
Actually, what I'm looking at here is the board actually had to go to warp 2.3. in order to generate the transwarp.
Okay. Wow, I got
There
it
you go.
right.
There you go.
That's
So,
wild.
but yeah, according to the article that I'm reading here, they used traditional warp drive, a navigational deflector, and also deflector shields. So basically, all three of those components were necessary in order to create the aperture for a transwarp aperture by producing a tachyon field in front of the ship to open it, essentially.
So
Basically.
tachyon-based propulsion. Now we're entering a new kind of propulsion. We're
Mhm.
discussing
Yep.
like warp. This is the new flow. We're getting sort of to the end, guys. We're 40 minutes in, just as a marking place, so you know.
Oh yeah.
We've had a wonderful conversation. It's been awesome.
Mhm.
Tachyons. These are faster than light particles that actually move so incredibly fast that they move backwards in time. Somehow in the Star Trek world, we can impinge on them. The solar sails come to mind,
Yep.
where you had the
Mhm.
tachyon eddy to the Denorius belt. They were able, through those materials, to allow it to interact with them. So this is
Mhm.
a very interesting idea because neutrinos are something that I would consider very close in ideation to what tachyons are, except that neutrinos are in our physical space-time. They don't move that incredibly fast. They move very
Yep.
fast. But we can't physically interact with neutrinos very easily. There's like in Sudbury, there's a nickel mine where we have this amazing like observatory in a cave where these things light up when a neutrino hits it. But the material science required to actually interact with tachyons, which is a hypothetical, theoretical,
Mhm.
like particle, would be so ridiculously advanced that I, in a way, can understand Transorph being kind of like a type of, instead of capturing the particle to use them, are you, maybe that is what's happening. How are we interacting with the tachyon to create propulsion, Brandon?
Well, okay. So, and I could be very wrong. It's been a while since I've dug into that. But my understanding of the whole system is you project a chronoton and a tachyon field throughout the ship, around the ship, and in front of the ship. It creates a breach in the subspace boundary layer and into the transwarp system.
Mhm.
Now, the way you do that is you actually take your deflector array, and the deflector dish system itself has the ability to generate tachyons.
Mhm.
Wow.
Now, as sorry to interrupt, but
No.
I also found it interesting that you mentioned that tachyons were a component in time travel as well, because that was actually demonstrated in the movie um, First Contact when the Borg actually used their transwarp network to travel back through time.
Right.
And I believe you and I, Brandon, were actually having a conversation the other day about that, where we were actually discussing how they possibly did that using their deflector network to essentially set a specific decay rate of the tachyons to get to a certain location in time. Not only
Exactly.
just distance, but to travel back, they have to set a specific decay rate of their tachyons to get to that particular moment in time. But I actually thought that was actually interesting as well. So,
And
but
and just to throw this out, I think actually, and after I went back and I looked at that, I think they created a temporal transwarp conduit.
That makes sense.
I
that
think
that
Because
would
that's
it would
make
what they
sense.
did.
Which
And
also allowed the Enterprise to follow them through
because it was
without
set
exactly
having
up,
to
yeah,
generate
and
it
it didn't
themselves.
correct.
because it didn't dissipate. So yeah, I think you're 100% correct on that. On the subject of tachyons,
Mhm.
tachyons are a light particle, right?
Hmm.
Think about the newest type of propulsion we've seen in the Star Trek universe. There's two of them. There's two brand new types of propulsion that we've never seen before. One of them is very similar to the coaxial drive, which is Discovery's mycelial jump drive,
Mycelial network, yeah. Drive, yeah.
and that's an instantaneous punch it, boom, you're there. The second one, which is the most new, which I'm actually interested to learn more about on the technology side, which we only get barely one glimpse of,
Mm-hmm.
is the Protostar Warp Drive. Now, from what we gather in the episode and what I've read about, is it looks like there's a proto star or a little baby star generating
Mm-hmm.
power in this engine core, and this is what generates the ability to travel faster than warp. The problem is how fast, how do you steer it, where does it go, how does it generate, how do you focus the energy? We don't know any of that, so this is a
No.
brand new piece of tech that
Mm-hmm.
I want to know more about. Gimme tech.
Totally.
Now
Gimme.
it's kind of interesting because
So
to
true.
to me, the way the wave almost looks like a boomerang in front of the ship. It
Mm-hmm.
looks to me almost like the ship is projecting some sort of deflector pulse in front of the ship to essentially shove its way through that space.
It's very possible. It could be per, my theory would be it's projecting a stellar wave
Oh, that makes sense.
That
to
would
just
that would
push
be
everything out of the way.
yeah.
It could
But
be, yeah, one of the forms of waves that we've already discussed.
Mhm.
exactly.
But
Similar
we
to
don't know.
Soliton. But we have no idea.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
we have
similar.
no
Yeah.
idea how it works
It
yet,
was
but
there for
Yeah,
all
yeah.
of what, 30 seconds at the tail end of the
if
episode?
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
yeah.
It's got its own drive. You can see that right there, actually, where you
Yeah,
have the tuna cells, and in
Mhm.
between you have, and yet all three of those are sending out the same exhaust.
exactly. So it's
Um,
interesting. It's so much interesting tech. I really am looking forward to seeing more of. Honestly, I'm really looking forward to seeing more of Prodigy. It might be on Nickelodeon. It might be a quote unquote kids show. Nah,
Who
no.
cares?
This has tech that I want to know. Therefore, it makes it an
for
adult
sure.
show for me. Because,
I
but
mean,
The framing of it is amazing. The idea
yeah,
oh
that
yeah,
it's like somehow between Alpha and Delta quadrants, and it's like a lost story, and we don't know. Like they're opening up the Federation. They're opening up like Voyager wasn't the only interaction. I like
yeah,
that.
and of
exactly.
course Kate Mulgrew, as Hollow Janeway, is freaking
It's on the
awesome.
ship.
She's
Yeah.
really good like that, yeah. I enjoy that there is that nostalgia or throwback to like another series, especially since it's dealing with
Exactly.
the Delta. I really like that. Of course, it's animated. They can do a lot more because it's animated, which I
Yeah,
like.
yeah,
I
that's
like
true.
I'm
Yeah,
enjoying Lower Decks as well. I'm really enjoying
Hmm.
agreed.
because it's irreverent and witty. It almost
Oh
reminds
yeah.
me of Final Space or Futurama. Like it has that
Yeah,
Hmm.
irreverent, which I love. I think that Star Trek sometimes takes itself quite seriously, which I love. Listen, I
Yeah.
take it seriously, but there has to be a point when you realize that they're real human beings. I've always been really interested in how the other human beings in Star Trek, like the regular people,
exactly.
actually like live their lives. And I
Yeah,
never pictured before. Yeah,
and
go
there's
ahead.
only like one episode of like the original series is that I'm aware of that actually did that, and that was what was it? The
Lower Decks from TNG.
no. It wasn't. No, it wasn't that one. It was actually the one from Voyager. Uh,
Good Shepherd. I
Good
knew
Shepherd.
exactly
Thank
what
you.
you're talking
Oh,
about.
with Voyager when
But
she
it's
takes them
basically
out and
where she's like, okay, well, some of my officers are underperforming, and I need them
yeah,
to go on an away mission because they've never been on one.
I
And
love that bit.
yeah,
I
And then she's
wanted
like,
so
the
so much
girl one is
more of
like,
that.
yeah, she's like, I don't work on your ship. I just live there. It's
right.
like, oh man.
But like like I said, that's pretty much one of the only examples of what of what the crew, the normal crew, not the officers do in
Exactly.
any of the shows that I've seen. Um, but it's nice to know that Lower Decks is kind of taking that approach and was like, okay, so this is what everybody else does while the
Exactly.
captain and the senior
Yeah.
officers are fooling around doing their thing.
It also gives us a glimpse of like the other part, like seeing the Pakleds or seeing the Vulcans or seeing like I love the episode where you saw the other lower decks from
The
the other.
Packets.
Yeah, yeah. Like
Uh,
little known species. The Tamarians, oh my god. So
Yep.
great. Anyway, I don't want to
Even
get us off
and
track.
even
Go ahead.
even they had Vulcan ships on there with the Vulcan ring warp drive. That's
yeah.
another type of
Yeah.
propulsion that we for the longest time thought that had disappeared on us, but nope, the Vulcans are still using their own ships with their own warp
Yeah.
drives. So, cool, fantastic.
Very
It's
cool.
canon.
Hmm.
It works. Now, to wrap us up, just to kind of wind us down, there's still so much more about propulsion we could talk,
Oh,
especially
absolutely.
propulsion about the future. We've got different types of propulsion that could even take us into, like, we've got interdimensional travel,
Hmm.
where Voyager goes home. They're from the Delta Quadrant. Boom, they're at Earth through a temporal and an interdimensional rift caused by the time ship Aeon, and they're back in the 1990s. So that's a type of travel, and we're granted it is time travel, but it's also proximity travel, so it is a type of propulsion. We've
And then
also
there was
got
that thing with Harry Kim where he entered that rift in that
into that rift and was
shuttlecraft.
exactly, and he was back in San Francisco, but he wasn't,
Oh
and yeah, so
yeah.
there's that. We also talk about different types of interdimensional and intertemporal rifts, from different places, different points in time, and then we're talking about time travel, which the
Yeah.
Enterprise did several times. The Defiant did
What was
once,
it?
thanks to an orb.
17 different violations of the
17 different
temporal.
temporal violations, exactly. The Defiant went back in
Oh,
time. The
him.
Enterprise E went back in time. Voyager transported someone through time. I mean, there's so many different types of things, and we could even go on and on and on about transport, not just
Hmm.
propulsion, but we could talk about things like the Iconian gateways
Yeah,
and
transport beaming.
the transwarp beaming. Yeah, exactly. And then we're talking transporters. Transporters themselves. They're not necessarily a type of propulsion, but they're a type of way of getting from A to B quick.
Hmm.
So, transport is a common theme and it has to be followed throughout all of Star Trek, but that is for another Tech Tuesday.
Hmm.
So, just to wrap us out here, Manny, I'm going to toss it back to you.
I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining me. I really enjoyed learning about all of these wonderful things and the differences between them. I think it's a really great wrap up to this series where we talked about past travel. Brian helped us like learn about that. The present, Brandon delineated some of the stuff about the RCS rocket, some manipulable, and then we had a very fun and lively conversation about future tech. Now there is just so much in Star Trek when we talk about how they think about propulsion through their space, and there's going to of course be differences between how they conceive of their space and us because we are just not there yet. We
Yeah.
have the math, but we don't, like, in terms of like warp or the Alcubierre drive and the newest like things. What they're proving to us is the enormous and bananas insanity energy requirements that are needed to actually warp space in the configurations, the geometric configurations that are necessary for this type of travel. But that's how we turn space fiction, science fiction, into science fantasy. Once upon a time, a cell phone was fiction. Once
Hmm.
upon a
Exactly.
time, laser sutures were a fiction.
Hmm.
Tricorders are now a thing. Like universal translators are a thing. So as long as we keep pushing forward these conversations, I think you're really going to see things, especially in propulsion, because really, like, we want to know one day, how do we like colonize our solar system? How do we get to a place where transportation on our own planet is like energetically like easy, where we don't have combustible engines? I think we're all in agreement that we want a better, safer world where it's like there's a freedom to go. Sometimes it's just so costly, it's preventative from seeing the other parts of our planet. This is like all of our planet. Like we should all be able to freely go from one end to the other. And I think one of those parts of our conversations, especially in terms of like the what type of engines the future will hold, a part of that is also tinted or colored with the idea that like we we also need to see this happen where we as humanity start to leave our planet and start to think of ourselves as beyond planet Earth.
Yeah.
And that's the other part that I think maybe that's implicit in our conversations. All of the types of propulsion that we discussed, they're getting us away from our planet. They're getting us
Yeah.
to a point where we are, growing and changing as a people. So I will just leave you with that. I think that we've had a great time discussing propulsion and the efficiencies of those propulsions. I think a lot of people were curious about how these things actually work. Brandon, thank you so much for getting into the nitty gritty and delineating all of these things. Really, like, I had no idea. And through these conversations, I've learned a lot. Brian, thank you for catching all of my mistakes here or there, or if I or specifying for us like what we needed to know. I'm gonna leave it with you guys to sign off, and then I'll take us out. Brian, go ahead. I want you to start.
Well, what was the final thoughts? Well, I hope that we can see something like that happening in our lifetime, where we're able to leave the planet and go, explore space, as civilians or whatever. But I think right now, I don't think that's going to happen because a lot of this stuff is way too expensive to produce these types of things where we can just jump on a shuttle and take off or whatever. But I think it would be nice if it did happen sometime in our lifetime.
Okay, Brandon, final thoughts?
My final thoughts are simply this: until we can get out there and explore space and explore strange new worlds and seek out new life and new civilizations, and until we can go boldly where no one's gone before, watch Star Trek, understand the tech side of it, understand the principles underlying it. Yes, it's a fun fantasy show. Yes, it's science fiction, but it's more science than you think.
Mm-hmm.
So dig into that part of it and think about how to apply that in our future. That's where I go with it. Because if we can take the science that we think we see and turn it into the science that we use,
Mm-hmm.
we will have a better future and the chance to do more. That's my final thought.
Thank you,
Yeah, I
Brandon.
think
Thank you
uh,
so
I
much.
think Manny said it earlier when he said science fiction has a way of becoming science fact. So yeah,
Okay, gentlemen, let's keep pushing forward. I can't wait to see
absolutely.
what next adventure we go on in these conversations. And as I always like to let you guys know, I really appreciate all the support and a lot of the conversation and helping me like frame it and stuff. So please, if you would like to, for all the people watching, please like and subscribe and comment. What would you like Brandon to talk about? What would you like Brian to talk about? What do you want me to bring up? What kind of flow are you interested in? What parts of Star Trek in the technology world would you like us to explore? So thank you so much for watching and thanks for joining us. Bye, guys.
Yeah.
Kapla.